governments. When I was in news department in the Foreign Office, we would control access to the Foreign Secretary as a form of reward to journalists if they were critical, if we felt they were too hostile to our account of events. We would not give them the goodies of trips with the Foreign Secretary around the world, or exclusive interviews every now and then. We did the same in New York. If journalists were not particularly supportive to our account, we would freeze them out. We would make life harder for them. But there is a subtle and private relationship between them, which is basically of favoritism, that certain journalists are rewarded with access for being supportive of the story. They will basically tell journalists, you carry on with that line, that kind of unjustified criticism of our government policy on X, Y, or Z, we will punish you. And that is very explicit, those kinds of threats. What happened was not an intelligence-based process. It was basically a PR process run by Number 10 to produce a document that was much more politically credible than the evidence suggested.
It was a major deception, wasn't it?
I think it amounts, in effect, to that, yes. I remember before I was sent to New York in late '97, I did the round of departments in London saying to them, OK, I'm going to New York, I'm going to be doing Iraq, what do I need to know? And I went to see non-proliferation department in the Foreign Office, and I was expecting a briefing on the vast piles of weapons that we still thought Iraq possessed. And the desk officers sort of looked at me slightly sheepishly and said, well, actually, we don't think there's anything. We don't think there's anything in Iraq. I said, that's extraordinary. I mean, I thought we had sanctions because we thought Iraq had large amounts of weapons. He said, no, the justification for sanctions is basically that we have unanswered questions about how those stocks were destroyed in the past. But what I feel very guilty about it. I feel very ashamed about it. I feel ashamed about it sitting talking to you. I feel actual shame running through my body when I talk to you about it.
Should journalists feel the same? Those who pass on the deception?
Absolutely. We should all be accountable to each other. I think that's the only way to have a civilized society, is some kind of transparency with each other and accountability, and people holding people morally accountable for what they do, and that applies to journalists as much as it applies to anybody.
These were to be the borders of Israel and Palestine when Israel was founded in 1948. And this is what's left of Palestine today, fragmented and dislocated by a military occupation that defies international law and is backed by one of the world's most sophisticated propaganda machines. This is Palestinian cameraman Imad Ghanin being shot repeatedly by Israeli soldiers. The killing of non-Western journalists is rarely news. Imad Ghanin was 21 and lost both his legs. Ten journalists have been killed by Israeli forces since 1992, and many more have been wounded. The pioneering Glasgow University Media Group has just published its latest study on the media reporting of Israel and Palestine.
I think what it comes down to is a basic knowledge that journalists have, which is quite simply that if they criticise Israel, then it's potentially trouble. If they criticise the Palestinians, then there is much less of a problem. So they might use a word like occupation, but they won't say military occupation, they won't say military rule, they won't explain in detail what it means. They certainly wouldn't do it routinely to explain in detail what it means to be living under military rule and why the Palestinians, from their point of view, are trying to overthrow that military rule, trying to throw off that control.
Professor Greg Philo, who heads the Glasgow unit, looking at his research, and it comes through very clear, is a certain state of fear exists on who the Israelis will complain to. They say in the research, people, producers worried, will they complain at Director General level? Or will they just simply ring the newsroom? But the point is this sense of intimidation, almost.
Welcome to the world of a correspondent who has to deal with this pressure on a daily basis. Yes, where I would take issue with you is the fear factor, because actually no correspondent that I have come across who is used to working in Jerusalem particularly or dealing with this stuff fears it at all.
I was thinking of people here at Television Centre.
We don't fear it either. We take a lot of it, but we don't fear it.
After we did the first book, I gave a number of talks to journalists in Britain, to BBC journalists, and I spent time with people who were senior producers on television news. And one of them said to me, in the context of quite a heated discussion that was going on with other journalists, he said, listen, he said, we wait in fear. That was his exact words. We wait in fear for the telephone call from the Israelis. He said the only issue we face then is how high up it's come from them. Has it come from a monitoring group? Has it come from the Israeli embassy? And then how high has it gone up our organisation? Is it the duty editor? Has it gone above that? Is it the Director General? He said, I have had journalists on the phone to me minutes before we've gone on a major news programme saying, what can I say? Which words can I use? Is it all right if I say this?
On May the 31st, 2010, Israeli forces attacked an aid flotilla headed for Gaza in international waters. They killed 9 people. In the days that followed, Israeli propaganda set out to manipulate the news agenda.
They were clubbed, they were beaten, stabbed. There was even a report of gunfire.
Don't you think it's fair to look at some coverage and say there's a tone? The tone was, of course, you didn't sit down and say we're going to put the Israeli point of view, but the tone throughout was that Israel had a problem. Not the people who were shot in the back of the head, but that Israel had a problem.
I think there are 2 things here. One is that, are you saying that actually we devalued human life? Because I don't think we did.
No, I didn't say
that. But I think
that.
it's legitimate to ask what the implications of this were going to be for Israel, which is what that question was attempting to do.
Tonight at 10, the Israelis under pressure after the raid on ships taking aid to Gaza. Hundreds of activists in the convoy were detained in Israel, including at least 40 British nationals.
They were pushing everybody and people running around, and they were hitting us with the back of the guns.
The Israelis are accused of carrying out a bloody massacre, but they claim it was self-defense.
Our planning for yesterday's interception was for a peaceful police operation. Our sailors on the job were told you are to use minimum force and maximum restraint.
The top of the main news was Mark Regev, unchallenged. Mark Regev, as you know, is the chief Israeli propagandist.
Mark Regev is a spokesman for the Israeli government. Now, you can describe him as a propagandist,
Well,
if
what
you
else
like.
is he?
But,
Please tell me.
Well, that's a pejorative way of putting what government spokespeople are. You know, they're entitled to express their point of view, and we have a duty to report it.
I'm afraid that polite view wouldn't be shared by the families of the people who were killed on the boat.
I absolutely accept that, and we have a duty to report that perspective as well.
Who's the Palestinian equivalent of Mark Regev, who appeared so often? Who's the Palestinian equivalent of all those mainly female Israeli spokespeople during Operation Cast Lead? Who was their equivalent, articulate in English, given a space right at the top of BBC News? Who is that?
I think that's a very good point. You know, who are those people? Yes.
Well, why hasn't the BBC...
But that's not our job to go out and appoint the Palestinian spokesperson.
But you say you're impartial. Surely you would find somebody to be, yes, have Mr. Regev saying his say, but then his equivalent.
We do, and we did.
You don't, actually. you don't have an equivalent of Mark Regev. That's just not true.
Just because there isn't an equivalent of Mark Regev doesn't mean to say that we didn't allow those viewpoints which you've just expressed to be heard across the range of our output.
This was ITV News on May the 31st, using the same Israeli footage.
Filmed with night vision cameras, Israeli commandos drop from helicopters onto the deck of a Turkish aid ship, and violent clashes erupt.
The immediate aftermath of the Israeli attack on the aid flotilla in June. For one thing, the Israelis supplied doctored film, even with captions, which was widely used across ITV and the BBC. It was labelled, sure. But the context of this, according to the Israelis, that their people who were attacking the flotilla were actually being attacked by the people who were on the flotilla. That Israeli perspective, propaganda, sure. Dominated.
Well, I don't think it dominated, but certainly the Israeli propaganda machine, as you well know, is very, very sophisticated. And in its own terms, is quite successful on occasions. And yes, it is the case that sometimes media organisations fall into a trap laid for them by...
it's only sophisticated because we allow them to be sophisticated.
But again, you know, it's only when you can come to write the history of these events that you can see it with that hindsight view, when it's actually happening on a daily basis. You've got to be very careful what you do. When the story is over, and when someone has the time and brain power left to actually kind of write the definitive history of it, sure. Then if you got things wrong, you put your hands up and you say, well, at that time, we weren't aware of that, we made a mistake, that's you know, that happens from time to time.
People like the Palestinians can't wait until someone writes a definitive history.
Yeah.
They depend on journalists now, don't they?
You're suggesting that journalists can... that the job of journalism is to change the world. It ain't. I've got to tell you, even someone with your massive experience should know better than that.
No, I'm not saying that. You're saying that.
Our job is to make sure that the public who consume our news are as informed as we can make them, so that they can make their own minds up.
But viewers can only make their own minds up if they're given all the available facts. Graphic independent video was available on the internet on the night of the attack. 4 months later, a United Nations investigation described the Israeli attack as displaying unnecessary and incredible violence. 6 people were executed at point-blank range. The attack warranted prosecution for war crimes. This was only reported in a 12-second item on ITV News and completely ignored on the 3 main BBC TV bulletins and seen only on News 24. One of the public relations triumphs of the 21st century was the rise of Barack Obama. His campaign slogan was, "Change we can believe in." He was a brand that offered something special, exciting. In 2008, Obama, the candidate, was voted Marketer of the Year, ahead of Apple, Nike, and Coors Beer. He made many people feel good, as if his slogan might be true. Above all, the perception of brand Obama was that he was against war.
Most of you know that I opposed this war from the start. I thought it was a tragic mistake.
But that was false. As president, Obama has not withdrawn America from Iraq and has backed US military action in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Somalia, and Yemen, and approved a military budget of $708 billion, the biggest war spending of all time. Cynthia McKinney is a former Congresswoman and Green Party candidate for president.
It's a great shame on the black political tradition in the United States to have a warmonger it's almost as if the black community in the United States, maybe we've lost our innocence too, because it would be very difficult to find